On December 23, 1995, 4 siblings from suburban Connecticut disappeared without a trace during what was supposed to be a magical pre-Christmas visit to Times Square. 29 years later, when their faces appeared on a digital billboard in the exact spot where they were last seen, it would finally begin to unravel one of New York City's most baffling missing persons cases. The story begins with the Morrison family of Westport, Connecticut. David Morrison, 45, was a successful investment banker who worked long hours on Wall Street but always made time for his children. His wife, Sarah, 42, had been a pediatric nurse before becoming a full-time mother to their 4 children. Emma, 16, twins Jake and Luke, 14, and little Sophie, 8. The Morrison family was, by all accounts, a picture-perfect American family. David coached his son's Little League teams, Sarah volunteered at the children's schools, and the family attended St. Matthew's Episcopal Church every Sunday. They lived in a colonial-style house on Maple Street, complete with a white picket fence and a golden retriever named Buddy. December 23, 1995, was meant to be the perfect family adventure. David had surprised his children 3 weeks earlier by announcing that instead of their usual Christmas Eve traditions, they would spend December 23rd in Manhattan, seeing the Radio City Christmas Spectacular, shopping at Feo Schwartz, and watching the famous Rockefeller Center Christmas tree lighting ceremony. "We're going to make this the most magical Christmas ever," Sarah had told her sister Patricia over the phone the night before. "The kids have been counting down the days. Emma's been practicing her photography because she wants to document everything, and Sophie hasn't stopped talking about meeting Santa at Macy's." The family left their Westport home at 9:30 a.m. on that crisp December morning. David drove their burgundy 1994 Ford Explorer, while Sarah sat in the passenger seat with a detailed itinerary she had spent weeks planning. The children were in their best winter clothes. Emma wore her new red wool coat, the twins were in matching navy blue jackets their grandmother had bought them, and Sophie was bundled in a pink puffy coat with a white fur-trimmed hood. According to the detailed timeline investigators would later reconstruct, the Morrison family arrived in Manhattan at approximately 11:15 a.m. They parked in a garage on West 47th Street, just 3 blocks from Times Square. David paid for 8 hours of parking, telling the attendant they planned to stay until after dinner. Their first stop was the Radio City Music Hall, where they had 12:30 p.m. tickets for the Christmas Spectacular. Fellow audience members would later tell police that the family seemed happy and excited during the show. Emma was seen taking photographs with her new camera, while Sophie clapped enthusiastically during every musical number. After the show ended at 2:15 p.m., the family walked to Feo Schwartz on 5th Avenue. Store security cameras captured them entering at 2:45 p.m. Emma was filming with her video camera, Jake and Luke were racing toward the toy displays, and Sophie was holding Sarah's hand, skipping with excitement. They spent nearly 2 hours in the store. David bought Sophie a life-size teddy bear, while the twins selected matching remote-control cars. Emma, more interested in photography than toys, purchased an additional roll of film for her camera. The family appeared relaxed and joyful in every security camera frame. At 4:30 p.m., they left Feo Schwartz and walked toward Times Square. This was the moment Sarah had been most excited about. In 1995, Times Square was undergoing a massive transformation from its gritty past into the family-friendly tourist destination it would become. The famous New Year's Eve ball was already installed atop One Times Square, and the area was decorated with enormous Christmas displays. Street performer Mario Benedetti, who was working his usual corner at Broadway and 42nd Street that day, clearly remembered the Morrison family approaching his area around 4:45 p.m. "The little girl in the pink coat was fascinated by my magic tricks," Benedetti would later tell investigators. "She kept asking her parents if they could watch just one more." The older girl was taking pictures of everything, and the 2 boys were trying to figure out how I made the coins disappear. According to Benedetti, the family watched his performance for approximately 15 minutes. David gave Sophie a $5 bill to put in the hat, and Emma took several photographs of the magic show. The twins were laughing and trying to catch Benedetti during his sleight-of-hand tricks. They were a beautiful family, Benedetti recalled. You could see how much the parents loved those kids and how excited the children were to be in Times Square. There was nothing unusual about them at all. At exactly 5 p.m., Benedetti finished his performance and began packing up his equipment. He remembered Sarah Morrison checking her watch and telling her family it was time to head toward Rockefeller Center for the tree lighting ceremony, which was scheduled to begin at 6 p.m. This was the last confirmed sighting of the Morrison family. What happened next would become one of the most thoroughly investigated and completely baffling disappearances in NYPD history. The tree lighting ceremony at Rockefeller Center proceeded as scheduled that evening. Thousands of people gathered to watch the famous Norwegian spruce come alive with 25,000 lights. But somewhere between Times Square and Rockefeller Center, just 6 blocks away, the Morrison family simply vanished. When the family failed to return to their car by the 8 p.m. parking deadline, the garage attendant initially assumed they had decided to stay out later and would pay the additional fees when they returned. It wasn't until the garage was closing at midnight that staff realized the burgundy Ford Explorer had been abandoned. The attendant found David's business card in the glove compartment and called the number. The call went to voicemail, but the attendant left a message assuming the family would retrieve it soon. Meanwhile, in Westport, Sarah's sister Patricia was becoming increasingly worried. Sarah had promised to call when they arrived safely back home, and it was unlike her to break such promises. When repeated calls to the Morrison house went unanswered, Patricia drove to Maple Street around 11:30 p.m. The house was dark and empty. Buddy, the family's golden retriever, was alone and distressed. Patricia used her spare key to enter and found no signs that the family had returned home. Sarah's purse, which she always left on the kitchen counter, was nowhere to be found. Patricia called the Westport police at 12:15 a.m. on December 24th, reporting her sister's family as missing. Initially, police suggested the family might have decided to stay overnight in Manhattan and would likely return on Christmas Eve. However, Patricia's insistence that this was completely out of character for her sister prompted officers to take the report seriously. By 2 a.m., Westport police had contacted the NYPD. When Manhattan officers discovered the abandoned Ford Explorer in the parking garage, the missing persons case was immediately escalated to the NYPD's Special Victims Unit. Detective Lieutenant Robert Chen, a 15-year veteran of the force who specialized in missing persons cases, was called in despite it being Christmas Eve. Chen would later describe the Morrison case as the most perplexing he had encountered in his career. Everything about this family suggested they were responsible, loving parents with well-behaved children, Chen would later testify. There were no signs of marital problems, financial difficulties, or any reason they would want to disappear voluntarily. And there was certainly no reason they would abandon their dog and their entire life in Connecticut. The initial investigation focused on retracing the family's known movements throughout December 23rd. Security cameras from Radio City Music Hall and FAO Schwartz confirmed the family's presence and revealed no signs of distress or unusual behavior. However, the investigation hit its first major obstacle when detectives attempted to trace the family's path from Times Square to Rockefeller Center. In 1995, security camera coverage in New York City was far less comprehensive than it would later become. The few cameras that covered the route between the two locations had either malfunctioned on December 23rd or had been obscured by Christmas decorations. It was like they walked into a blind spot in the city's surveillance system, Detective Chen explained to reporters years later. We had clear footage of them entering Times Square, but no footage of them leaving. It was as if they had simply evaporated. The NYPD deployed over 50 officers to canvass the Times Square area on Christmas Eve, interviewing street performers, vendors, tourists, and anyone else who might have seen the Morrison family. The response was overwhelming, but ultimately unhelpful. Dozens of people remembered seeing families that matched the Morrison description, but in the chaos of pre-Christmas Times Square, no one could provide definitive confirmation or useful details about what had happened to them. Mario Benedetti, the street performer who had been the last person to interact with the family, was interviewed extensively. He underwent hypnosis sessions to help recover any additional memories and submitted to multiple polygraph tests. All results confirmed his story and revealed no deception. "I keep thinking there must have been something I missed," Benedetti told investigators. "Some sign that something was wrong, or someone following them, or anything that seemed off. But I've gone over that day thousands of times in my mind, and there was nothing. They were just a happy family enjoying Christmas in New York." The investigation expanded beyond Manhattan as detectives considered the possibility that the family had left the city voluntarily or been taken elsewhere. Airports, train stations, and bus terminals throughout the tri-state area were put on alert. The FBI was brought in to assist with the investigation, particularly to examine the possibility of kidnapping or human trafficking. David Morrison's financial records were scrutinized in detail. His investment banking career had been successful but not exceptionally lucrative, and the family lived comfortably but not extravagantly. There were no large debts, no evidence of gambling problems, and no unusual financial transactions in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. Sarah's background was equally unremarkable. Hospital colleagues described her as a dedicated professional who had reluctantly left nursing to focus on raising her children. She was active in the PTA, coached Sophie's youth soccer team, and had no known enemies or conflicts. The children's schools were contacted, and investigators interviewed teachers, coaches, and classmates. All reports painted a picture of a normal, well-adjusted family. Emma was an honor student with plans to attend Columbia University. Jake and Luke were popular athletes who played baseball and basketball. Sophie was described by her teacher as a delightful child who brought joy to everyone around her. As Christmas passed without any sign of the Morrison family, the case began attracting national media attention. The story of 4 siblings disappearing in the heart of Manhattan during the holiday season captured the public's imagination and generated thousands of tips and potential sightings. Unfortunately, most of these leads proved to be false alarms. Families matching the Morrison description were reported in shopping malls from California to Florida, but none of the sightings could be confirmed. Several alleged witnesses came forward claiming to have seen the family being forced into vehicles or led away by suspicious individuals, but their stories couldn't be corroborated and often contained contradictory details. The most promising lead came on December 28th, when a Port Authority police officer reported seeing a family matching the Morrison description boarding a Greyhound bus to Philadelphia on the evening of December 23rd. However, when investigators reviewed the bus company's records and security footage, no evidence of the Morrison family could be found. By New Year's Eve 1995, exactly 1 week after the family's disappearance, the NYPD had conducted over 200 interviews, followed up on more than 500 tips, and deployed investigators to 6 different states. Despite these extensive efforts, they were no closer to understanding what had happened to the Morrison family than they had been on Christmas Eve. The case remained active throughout 1996, with detectives continuing to follow leads and re-interview witnesses. The FBI maintained their involvement, particularly after similar family disappearances were reported in other major cities. However, none of these cases proved to be connected to the Morrison disappearance. David and Sarah Morrison's families offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to the safe return of the four siblings. The reward was later increased to $250,000 in 1997 and again to $500,000 in 2000. Despite the substantial sum, no credible information ever came forward. Emma Morrison's camera was never found, which frustrated investigators who hoped the photographs and video she had taken might provide clues about what happened to the family. The missing camera became a symbol of all the questions that remained unanswered about December 23, 1995. As the years passed, the Morrison case became one of those legendary unsolved mysteries that haunted everyone who worked on it. Detective Chen continued investigating the case even after his retirement in 2010, maintaining files and following up on occasional leads that still trickled in. "I never stopped believing we would find them," Chen said in a 2015 interview marking the 20th anniversary of the disappearance. "Families don't just vanish without leaving some trace. Somewhere, somehow, there had to be evidence of what happened to them." The Morrison house in Westport remained empty for 2 years after the disappearance. Patricia Morrison maintained the property, hoping against hope that her sister's family would somehow return. Eventually, the house was sold, with the proceeds placed in a trust fund for the 4 children in case they were ever found alive. Buddy, the family's golden retriever, lived with Patricia until his death in 2003. According to Patricia, Buddy never stopped waiting for his family to come home. He would sit by the front window of Patricia's house every day, watching for the familiar burgundy Ford Explorer that would never arrive. The case officially remained open but inactive as the NYPD and FBI exhausted their investigative leads. Every few years, a new detective would be assigned to review the files, hoping that fresh eyes might spot something previous investigators had missed. Each review confirmed the same baffling conclusion. On December 23, 1995, the Morrison family had simply ceased to exist. Local and national media revisited the story annually on the anniversary of the disappearance. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, America's Most Wanted, and dozens of other television programs. Each exposure generated a new wave of tips and potential sightings, but none ever led to a breakthrough. As the investigation stretched from months to years to decades, the Morrison disappearance became part of New York City folklore. Tour guides in Times Square would sometimes mention the case to visitors, describing it as one of the area's most enduring mysteries. Street performers who had worked the same corners as Mario Benedetti would tell tourists about the family that vanished after watching a magic show. The case also became a case study in police academies and criminology programs across the country. How could 4 people, including 2 teenagers and an 8-year-old child, disappear without a trace in one of the most surveilled and crowded places in America? What did the Morrison case reveal about the limitations of missing persons investigations in urban environments? For nearly 3 decades, these questions remained unanswered. The Morrison family had become like ghosts of Times Square, remembered but never found, mourned but never buried. Then, on December 23, 2024, exactly 29 years after their disappearance, something extraordinary happened. At 4:45 p.m., the exact time when the family had last been seen watching Mario Benedetti's magic show, a digital billboard in Times Square displayed 4 familiar faces. The images showed Emma, Jake, Luke, and Sophie Morrison exactly as they had appeared on that long-ago December day. But these weren't old photographs from 1995. These were recent pictures showing the 4 siblings as adults, clearly alive and somewhere in the world. The billboard display lasted only 60 seconds before cycling back to its regular advertisements. But that single minute would finally begin to unravel the mystery that had confounded investigators for nearly 3 decades. Because someone, somewhere, had been keeping track of the Morrison family all along, and after 29 years of silence, they were finally ready to reveal what had really happened on that December day in Times Square. The truth, when it finally emerged, would prove to be far more complex and shocking than anyone had ever imagined. The Morrison family hadn't disappeared because of a crime, an accident, or a voluntary decision to flee their old life. They had disappeared because they had been chosen. The investigation into the Morrison family disappearance would become one of the most extensive and well-documented missing persons cases in NYPD history. Over the course of 29 years, it would involve hundreds of detectives, FBI agents, private investigators, and volunteers, consuming thousands of hours and costing millions of dollars in resources. What made the case so frustrating for investigators was not a lack of evidence, but rather the complete absence of any logical explanation for what had happened. Every lead seemed promising until it was thoroughly investigated, and every theory eventually crumbled under scrutiny. Detective Lieutenant Robert Chen, who became the case's primary investigator, established a command center in the NYPD's One Police Plaza headquarters on December 26, 1995. The room was quickly filled with maps, photographs, timelines, and witness statements as Chen assembled a team of 12 detectives to work the case full-time. From the beginning, we knew this was different from typical missing persons cases, Chen would later write in his memoir. Most people who disappear leave some kind of trail: financial transactions, personal conflicts, behavioral changes in the weeks before they vanish. The Morrisons left nothing. The first phase of the investigation focused on what Chen termed the golden hour, the period from 5 p.m. on December 23rd, when the family was last seen in Times Square, to midnight, when their car was discovered abandoned. If the family had been abducted, trafficked, or met with foul play, Chen reasoned, traces of that activity should be discoverable within this time frame. The team began by creating a detailed minute-by-minute reconstruction of the family's day. They interviewed every employee who had interacted with the Morrisons at Radio City Music Hall and FAO Schwartz. They tracked down fellow audience members from the Christmas Spectacular who had sat near the family. They spoke with store clerks, security guards, parking attendants, and street vendors throughout Manhattan. Detective Maria Santos, Chen's partner on the case, was assigned to coordinate the witness interviews. "We talked to over 300 people in the first week alone," Santos recalled. "Everyone was cooperative, everyone wanted to help, but no one had seen anything unusual. The family had been invisible in their normalcy." The investigation's first major breakthrough came on December 30th, when detectives discovered that Emma Morrison's video camera had captured more footage than anyone initially realized. When the family's video equipment was found in their hotel room, they had been planning to stay overnight at the Marriott Marquis after the tree lighting ceremony. Investigators found a partially used videotape. The tape contained 23 minutes of footage from the family's day in Manhattan. Emma had been documenting their adventure with the enthusiasm of a future filmmaker, capturing everything from their arrival at Radio City to their departure from FAO Schwartz. FBI video analyst Dr. Rebecca Martinez was brought in to examine every frame of the footage. Her analysis revealed several important details that witnesses had missed or forgotten. Most significantly, the video showed that the family had been followed. At 3:47 p.m., while the family was in FAO Schwartz, Emma's camera inadvertently captured a man in a dark coat who appeared to be watching them from across the store, Dr. Martinez reported. The same individual appears in the background of footage taken outside the store at 4:25 p.m. and again at 4:40 p.m. as the family approached Times Square. The man was described as approximately 40 years old, average height and build, wearing a dark wool coat and a baseball cap that obscured his features. The video quality was insufficient to provide a clear facial identification, but the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit determined that his movements were consistent with surveillance behavior. He maintained a distance of approximately 50 feet from the family at all times, Dr. Martinez noted. He appeared to anticipate their movements and positioned himself to maintain visual contact while avoiding direct interaction. This suggests professional training or extensive experience in surveillance techniques. This discovery led to the case's first major theory. The Morrison family had been specifically targeted for abduction by an individual or organization with sophisticated capabilities. The FBI expanded their investigation to include known human trafficking networks, organized crime syndicates, and international kidnapping rings. Special Agent Catherine Morrison, no relation to the missing family, was assigned as the FBI's lead investigator. A specialist in organized crime and human trafficking, Agent Morrison had worked similar cases throughout the northeastern United States. The surveillance element suggested this wasn't a crime of opportunity, Agent Morrison explained in congressional testimony years later. Someone had likely been tracking this family for days or weeks, studying their patterns, planning the operation. This level of sophistication indicated we were dealing with a highly organized criminal enterprise. The FBI's investigation revealed disturbing patterns that initially seemed to support the organized abduction theory. Over the previous 5 years, 17 families had disappeared under similar circumstances in major metropolitan areas across the United States. All involved middle-class families with children, all occurred in crowded public places, and all left behind abandoned vehicles and no traces of struggle or foul play. The cases stretched from Seattle to Miami, with disappearances reported in Chicago, Denver, Atlanta, and Boston. In each case, the families had been visiting tourist attractions or attending public events when they vanished. Like the Morrisons, they had simply walked away from security cameras and never been seen again. We started calling them clean extractions, Agent Morrison recalled. These weren't typical kidnappings where victims were grabbed off the street. These were precise professional operations that left no evidence and no witnesses. The FBI established a task force to investigate potential connections between the cases. They analyzed family demographics, financial backgrounds, travel patterns, and any possible links between the victims. The investigation consumed enormous resources and involved coordination with law enforcement agencies in 12 states. However, after 18 months of intensive investigation, the task force was forced to conclude that the cases were not connected. Each family had different backgrounds, destinations, and circumstances surrounding their disappearances. The similarities appeared to be coincidental rather than evidence of a coordinated criminal enterprise. It was one of the most frustrating conclusions I've ever had to reach, Agent Morrison admitted. The pattern seemed so clear, so obvious, but when we dug deeper, the connections fell apart. We were seeing patterns where none existed. Meanwhile, in New York, Detective Chen was pursuing a different angle. His team had discovered that David Morrison had received several unusual phone calls in the weeks leading up to the family's trip to Manhattan. The calls had come from a number that was later traced to a disconnected payphone in Grand Central Terminal. Sarah Morrison's sister, Patricia, told investigators that Sarah had mentioned the calls during their last conversation. Sarah said David was getting calls from someone who claimed to represent a travel agency offering free vacation packages, Patricia recalled. David thought it was a scam, but the caller seemed to know details about their family that a random telemarketer wouldn't have. The investigation into these phone calls led detectives down a rabbit hole of fake travel agencies, identity theft schemes, and sophisticated confidence operations. Several similar scams were operating in the New York area during 1995, targeting affluent suburban families with offers of discounted or free vacation packages. However, none of these operations involved kidnapping or family disappearances. They were financial scams designed to steal credit card information or persuade victims to pay upfront fees for non-existent vacations. The connection to the Morrison disappearance appeared to be another dead end. As 1996 progressed, the investigation began to show signs of strain. The NYPD had assigned 12 detectives to work the case full-time for 6 months, an unprecedented allocation of resources for a missing persons investigation. Public pressure to solve the case was enormous, but the complete absence of leads was demoralizing the entire investigative team. Detective Santos left the case in September 1996 to take a position with the district attorney's office. In her final report, she wrote, "After 9 months of investigation, we have conclusively determined what did not happen to the Morrison family. They were not killed in Manhattan. They did not leave the city by any conventional means of transportation. They were not taken by any known criminal organization, and they did not disappear voluntarily. What we cannot determine is what actually did happen to them." The case attracted attention from private investigators, psychics, conspiracy theorists, and amateur detectives throughout the late 1990s. Several private investigation firms offered to work the case pro bono, hoping that success would generate publicity for their businesses. The most notable private investigator to work the case was former FBI agent Thomas Sullivan, who had retired after 20 years with the Bureau and established a missing persons specialty practice. Sullivan spent 3 years and his own money investigating the Morrison disappearance, using contacts throughout law enforcement and the intelligence community. Sullivan's investigation took him to 12 countries and involved interviews with former KGB agents, CIA operatives, and international intelligence specialists. His theory was that the Morrison family had somehow become involved in Cold War espionage activities and had been eliminated or relocated by government agencies. The precision of their disappearance was unlike anything I had seen in civilian criminal cases, Sullivan wrote in his 400-page report on the investigation. The complete absence of evidence, the sophisticated surveillance, the timing, everything suggested an intelligence operation. Somebody with significant resources and government-level capabilities made this family disappear. Sullivan's investigation revealed that David Morrison had briefly worked for a defense contractor in the early 1980s before his career in investment banking. The contractor, Hartley Defense Systems, had held several classified contracts with the Department of Defense during the Reagan administration. However, when Sullivan attempted to access Morrison's employment records from Hartley Defense Systems, he discovered that the company had been dissolved in 1987 and all personnel files had been sealed by the Department of Defense. His requests for information through the Freedom of Information Act were denied on national security grounds. The government's refusal to release information about Morrison's employment history convinced me that I was on the right track, Sullivan later said. But it also made clear that I would never be able to prove my theory through conventional investigation methods. Sullivan's espionage theory gained traction in certain circles, particularly among conspiracy researchers and alternative media outlets. However, it was ultimately dismissed by law enforcement agencies due to lack of concrete evidence and the implausibility of a government operation targeting an entire family, including young children. As the case entered its 3rd year, Detective Chen made the difficult decision to reduce the active investigation team from 12 detectives to 3. The Morrison case remained a priority, But the NYPD could no longer justify the enormous resource allocation with so few results to show for the effort. We had reached the point where we were reinvestigating the same leads over and over again, Chen explained in a 1998 interview. Every possible angle had been explored, every witness had been interviewed multiple times, every piece of evidence had been analyzed exhaustively. We needed to accept that conventional police work wasn't going to solve this case. The case's profile was boosted significantly in 1999 when it was featured on the television program Unsolved Mysteries. The episode, which aired on February 17, 1999, generated over 2,000 phone calls to the show's tip line within 48 hours. Most of the calls were from well-meaning viewers who thought they had seen the Morrison family in their communities. These sightings were reported from every state in the country and several foreign countries. Each potential sighting was investigated by local law enforcement, but none proved to be credible. However, the Unsolved Mysteries episode did produce one significant lead. A woman named Carol Henderson called to report that she had been approached by a man matching the description of the surveillance suspect from Emma's video. The approach had occurred in Boston in November 1995, approximately 1 month before the Morrison disappearance. Henderson told investigators that the man had approached her in Faneuil Hall while she was shopping with her 3 children. He had asked detailed questions about her family, claiming to represent a marketing research company studying family spending patterns during the holiday season. "He knew things about my family that he shouldn't have known," Henderson told Boston police. "He knew my children's names. He knew where they went to school. He knew what my husband did for work. When I asked how he had obtained this information, he became evasive and walked away quickly." The Boston Police Department worked with the NYPD to investigate Henderson's report. They discovered that similar approaches had been reported by families in Hartford, Philadelphia, and Baltimore during the fall of 1995. In each case, a man matching the suspect's description had approached middle-class families with children, asking probing questions about their personal lives and family routines. This discovery supported the theory that the Morrison family had been specifically targeted as part of a larger operation. However, investigators were unable to identify the suspect or determine the purpose of the family research he appeared to be conducting. The investigation received another boost in 2001 when advances in digital video enhancement technology allowed the FBI to extract clearer images from Emma Morrison's videotape. The enhanced footage provided a better view of the surveillance suspect's face, enabling the creation of a more detailed composite sketch. The new composite sketch was distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide and published in major newspapers and magazines. It generated hundreds of tips and potential identifications, but none led to the suspect's apprehension or provided new information about the Morrison case. As the case entered its second decade, it became a training exercise for new detectives and FBI agents. The complete case file, which had grown to over 10,000 pages, was used in police academies and federal training programs as an example of how even the most thorough investigation could fail to solve a case when evidence simply didn't exist. Detective Chen retired from the NYPD in 2010, but he continued working the Morrison case as a volunteer consultant. He maintained relationships with active investigators and followed up on new leads that occasionally emerged. His obsession with the case became legendary within the department. Chen never let go of that case, remembered Detective Captain James Rodriguez, who worked under Chen during the 1990s. Even after he retired, he would call the precinct every few months to ask if there had been any new developments. He kept detailed files at his home and continued investigating leads on his own time. Madi, in 2015, marking the 20th anniversary of the disappearance, the FBI announced that they were officially suspending active investigation of the Morrison case. The announcement was controversial. generating criticism from the family's relatives and advocacy groups for missing persons. 20 years is long enough, FBI Director James Comey said at a press conference. We have exhausted every possible investigative avenue. The case remains open, and we will follow up on any credible new information, but we can no longer justify dedicating active resources to this investigation. The FBI's decision to suspend the investigation was met with protests from Patricia Morrison, who had become the primary advocate for finding her sister's family. She organized rallies in Times Square and lobbied Congress to maintain federal involvement in the case. "They're giving up on my sister and her children," Patricia told reporters. 20 years may seem like a long time, but these are 4 human beings who deserve to be found. Someone, somewhere, knows what happened to them. Despite the official suspension of active investigation, the Morrison case continued to generate periodic interest from law enforcement, media, and the public. Cold case units in various police departments occasionally reviewed the files, hoping that new technology or fresh perspectives might reveal overlooked clues. The case was featured in numerous television documentaries, podcasts, and true crime publications throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Each new examination of the case brought renewed attention and sometimes generated new tips, but the fundamental mystery remained unsolved. In 2020, advances in DNA analysis technology prompted the NYPD to re-examine physical evidence from the case. Hair fibers and other trace evidence collected from the Morrison family's abandoned car were subjected to new testing procedures that hadn't been available in 1995. The DNA analysis confirmed that the evidence belonged to members of the Morrison family and contained no traces of unknown individuals. This finding effectively ruled out scenarios involving struggle or violence inside the vehicle, but provided no new information about what had happened to the family. As the case approached its 30th anniversary in 2024, it had become part of New York City folklore. True crime enthusiasts made pilgrimages to Times Square to visit the location where the family was last seen. Street performers in the area were frequently asked about the case by tourists. Mario Benedetti, the magician who had been the last person to interact with the Morrison family, had died in 2018. In his final interview before his death, he maintained that he had told investigators everything he remembered about December 23, 1995. "Not a day goes by that I don't think about that family," Benedetti said. "I keep wondering if there was something I should have noticed, some sign that something was wrong, but they seemed so happy, so normal. There was nothing that suggested anything bad was about to happen to them." The Morrison case had consumed the careers of dozens of investigators, generated thousands of pages of reports, and cost millions of dollars in investigative resources. Despite all these efforts, the fundamental questions remained unanswered. What had happened to the Morrison family? Where had they gone? Were they still alive? Then, on December 23, 2024, exactly 29 years after their disappearance, those questions would finally begin to receive answers. But the truth, when it emerged, would prove to be far stranger than any theory investigators had ever considered. The digital billboard in Times Square that displayed their faces for 60 seconds would be just the beginning of a revelation that would challenge everything law enforcement thought they knew about missing persons cases, witness reliability, and the nature of disappearance itself, because the Morrison family hadn't vanished due to crime, accident, or choice. They had vanished because they had been selected for something that conventional investigation could never have uncovered, something that existed beyond the reach of police work and criminal justice. At exactly 4:45 p.m. on December 23, 2024, Maria Santos was walking through Times Square when she stopped dead in her tracks. The former NYPD detective, now 61 years old and working as a private security consultant, found herself staring at a digital billboard that displayed 4 faces she had never forgotten in nearly 3 decades. Emma, Jake, Luke, and Sophie Morrison looked back at her from the massive screen. But these weren't the children she remembered from 1995. These were adults. Emma appeared to be in her 40s, the twins in their early 40s, and Sophie in her mid-30s. They were wearing unfamiliar clothing and appeared to be in some kind of institutional setting, with white walls and fluorescent lighting behind them. But what shocked Santos most was the text that appeared beneath their faces. The Morrison family. Safe and protected since 1995. Thank you for your service to humanity. The message lasted exactly 60 seconds before cycling back to a Toyota commercial. Santos frantically pulled out her phone to record the billboard, but the advertisement had already changed. She stood in the crowd of tourists, wondering if she had just experienced some kind of stress-induced hallucination. However, Santos wasn't the only person who had seen the billboard. Within hours, social media was flooded with cell phone videos from tourists who had managed to capture portions of the 60-second display. The images were grainy and partial, but they clearly showed adult versions of the Morrison children with the mysterious message about their safety and service to humanity. By 8 p.m. that evening, the story had been picked up by local news stations. By midnight, it was trending on every major social media platform. The Morrison family, forgotten by many after 3 decades, was suddenly international news again. Detective Lieutenant Robert Chen, now 78 years old and battling early-stage Alzheimer's disease, was contacted by reporters at his assisted living facility in Queens. When shown the cell phone videos of the billboard, Chen's reaction was immediate and visceral. "That's them," he said, his eyes filling with tears. "That's definitely them. But they look like they've been living normal lives somewhere. How is that possible?" The NYPD's current cold case unit, led by Detective Captain Jennifer Walsh, immediately launched an investigation into the billboard incident. Walsh had reviewed the Morrison case files numerous times throughout her career and was intimately familiar with every detail of the original investigation. The first question we needed to answer was who had paid for that billboard space and how they had obtained recent photographs of the Morrison family, Walsh explained to reporters. If these people were alive and had been living somewhere for 29 years, we needed to find them immediately. The investigation into the billboard led to Clearview Digital Advertising, the company that managed the Times Square display. However, when detectives arrived at Clearview's offices on December 24th, they discovered that the company had no record of anyone purchasing advertising space for December 23rd at 4:45 p.m. According to our system, that time slot was supposed to be running a Coca-Cola advertisement, explained Clearview's technical director Michael Harrison. We have no record of the Morrison family content being uploaded to our servers and no record of anyone paying for that specific time slot. The technical investigation revealed something even more puzzling. Analysis of the billboard's digital systems showed that the Morrison family content had been inserted into the advertising rotation by someone with advanced hacking capabilities. The insertion had been so sophisticated that it bypassed all of Clearview's security protocols without triggering any alarms. This wasn't some amateur operation, Harrison told investigators. Whoever did this had professional-level access to our systems and knew exactly how to manipulate our advertising queue. They would need detailed knowledge of our technical infrastructure and significant cybersecurity expertise. The FBI's cyber division was brought in to investigate the billboard hacking. Special Agent Sarah Kim, a specialist in cyber terrorism and advanced persistent threats, led a team of analysts to examine every aspect of the digital intrusion. What we found was unlike anything we had encountered before, Agent Kim later testified before Congress. The intrusion was so sophisticated that it appeared to have been executed by someone with access to classified government hacking tools. But there was no evidence of foreign involvement or domestic terrorism. The cybersecurity investigation revealed that the hacking had originated from a location that didn't exist according to any records. The IP address trace led to coordinates in the middle of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, but satellite imagery showed only dense forest in that location. While the technical investigation continued, Detective Walsh focused on the content of the Billboard message itself. The phrase, "service to humanity," suggested that the Morrison family's disappearance might have been connected to some kind of volunteer or humanitarian work. Walsh's team began researching humanitarian organizations, research institutions, and government agencies that might have recruited entire families for classified or long-term projects. The investigation expanded to include interviews with former employees of NASA, the CIA, the CDC, and various scientific research organizations. The breakthrough came on December 28th, when Walsh received a call from Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a retired researcher who had worked for the Department of Energy from 1985 to 2010. Dr. Harper said she had been following the news coverage of the Billboard incident and believed she might have information about the Morrison family. "I can't discuss details over the phone," Dr. Harper told Walsh, "but I can tell you that the Morrison family's disappearance wasn't random, and they weren't taken against their will. They were recruited for something that I can only describe as the most important project in human history." Dr. Harper agreed to meet with investigators at a secure location in Washington, D.C. On December 30th, Walsh and Agent Kim flew to the Capitol to hear what the retired scientist had to say. Dr. Harper's revelation was extraordinary. She explained that in 1994, a consortium of government agencies, international organizations, and private research institutions had begun secretly recruiting families for what was known as the Continuity Project. The project was based on the premise that human civilization faced multiple existential threats during the coming decades, Dr. Harper explained. Climate change, nuclear war, pandemic diseases, asteroid impacts. The list was extensive. The Continuity Project was designed to ensure that human knowledge, culture, and genetic diversity would survive regardless of what happened to the surface population. The Continuity Project involved establishing hidden communities in remote locations around the world. These communities were designed to be completely self-sufficient and to preserve human civilization in the event of global catastrophe. Each community required diverse populations with various skills, ages, and genetic backgrounds. Families were specifically targeted because they represented stable social units that could adapt to new environments while maintaining psychological well-being, Dr. Harper continued. The Morrison family was selected because they possessed an ideal combination of intelligence, emotional stability, diverse skills, and genetic health. According to Dr. Harper, the selection process for the Continuity Project involved extensive surveillance and evaluation of potential candidates. Families were observed for months or years before being approached for recruitment. The surveillance detected in Emma Morrison's video had been part of this evaluation process. The man following them in Times Square wasn't planning to abduct them, Dr. Harper explained. He was there to make the final approach and extend the recruitment offer. The timing had to be perfect because the families needed to be completely isolated from their previous lives to maintain the project's security. Dr. Harper revealed that the phone calls David Morrison had received in the weeks before their disappearance had been preliminary contact from Continuity Project recruiters. The calls had been designed to gauge the family's interest in special opportunities without revealing the true nature of the project. The recruitment process was entirely voluntary, Dr. Harper emphasized. No family was ever forced to participate, but once they agreed to join the project, they had to cut all ties with their previous lives. Complete disappearance was the only way to maintain operational security. The revelation that the Morrison family had voluntarily joined a secret survival project explained many of the puzzling aspects of their disappearance. It accounted for the lack of evidence of struggle or foul play, the sophisticated nature of their vanishing, and the complete absence of traces despite extensive investigation. However, it also raised new questions about government overreach, informed consent, and the ethics of recruiting entire families, including young children, for classified projects. Agent Kim immediately contacted her superiors to report the potential national security implications of Dr. Harper's revelations. If what Dr. Harper was telling us was true, it meant that multiple government agencies had been involved in secretly recruiting American families for decades, Agent Kim later testified. This represented a massive violation of civil liberties and constitutional rights, regardless of the project's stated humanitarian purposes. Indeed, the investigation into the Continuity Project revealed a complex network of government agencies, international organizations, and private contractors that had been operating in secret since the early 1990s. The project had recruited approximately 500 families worldwide, establishing hidden communities in locations ranging from underground bunkers to remote islands. However, when investigators attempted to locate these communities or verify Dr. Harper's claims, they encountered a wall of classified information and national security restrictions. Multiple government agencies denied knowledge of the Continuity Project, and efforts to obtain information through the Freedom of Information Act were blocked on national security grounds. The story took another dramatic turn on January 5, 2025, when Patricia Morrison, the aunt who had spent 29 years searching for her sister's family, received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified herself as Emma Morrison. "Aunt Patricia," the voice said, "I know this is difficult to believe, but it's really me. I'm calling to let you know that we're all safe and well. We've been living in a protected community, and we've been unable to contact our previous life until now." Patricia, now 71 years old, was initially skeptical that the caller was actually her niece. However, Emma provided detailed information about family memories and personal details that only the real Emma Morrison could have known. "She knew about the time I took her to see The Lion King on Broadway when she was 12, Patricia later told investigators. She remembered the exact conversation we had afterward about wanting to be a filmmaker. She knew things that no one else could have known. During the 15-minute phone call, Emma explained that her family had been living in a research community in a location she couldn't reveal. She said they had been participating in important scientific work related to climate change and environmental preservation. "We wanted to contact you earlier," Emma told her aunt, "but the project required complete isolation for security reasons. The Billboard was our way of letting the world know that we were safe without compromising the project's confidentiality." Emma also revealed that the twins, Jake and Luke, had become environmental scientists, while Sophie had specialized in sustainable agriculture. Emma herself had become a documentary filmmaker, creating educational materials about environmental preservation for future generations. "We've had good lives," Emma assured her aunt. "We've received excellent educations. We've been able to pursue our interests, and we've been contributing to work that we believe is vital for humanity's future. But we've missed our family terribly." The phone call was recorded by the FBI with Patricia's consent. Voice analysis confirmed that the speaker exhibited speech patterns and vocal characteristics consistent with Emma Morrison, accounting for nearly 3 decades of aging and potential accent changes due to geographic relocation. However, the call also raised new ethical questions about the Continuity Project. Emma had been only 16 years old when her family disappeared, legally a minor who couldn't have provided informed consent for such a life-altering decision. Sophie had been only 8 years old, clearly too young to understand the implications of joining a secret community. The case attracted the attention of civil liberties organizations, legal experts, and ethicists who argued that the Continuity Project represented a serious violation of human rights and family law. Even if the project's goals were legitimate, critics argued, the methods used to recruit families were unacceptable in a democratic society. No government agency has the right to secretly recruit entire families, including young children, for classified projects, argued constitutional law professor Dr. James Mitchell. The fact that the families may have eventually adapted to their new lives doesn't justify the original deception and forced separation from their extended families and communities. The controversy intensified when it was revealed that several other unsolved disappearances from the 1990s and 2000s had likely been Continuity Project recruitments. Families from Seattle, Denver, Atlanta, and other cities had vanished under similar circumstances, leaving behind the same puzzling absence of evidence that had characterized the Morrison case. On January 15, 2025, Representative Maria Rodriguez of New York announced that Congress would hold hearings to investigate the Continuity Project and its impact on American families. The hearings would examine whether government agencies had overstepped their authority and violated constitutional rights in their recruitment efforts. The American people deserve to know the truth about what their government has been doing in secret for the past 30 years, Representative Rodriguez said. While environmental preservation and disaster preparedness are important goals, they cannot justify deceiving and separating families without their full knowledge and consent. The Morrison family's story, which had begun as an unsolvable mystery, had evolved into a national debate about government secrecy, individual rights, and the ethics of long-term survival planning. The billboard in Times Square had indeed revealed the truth about their disappearance, but it had also opened questions that society was only beginning to grapple with. Emma Morrison's promise to her aunt that the family would find a way to maintain contact while continuing their work suggested that the story was far from over. The Continuity Project, whatever its ultimate goals and methods, would now have to operate under the scrutiny of public attention and congressional oversight. Detective Chen, despite his advancing Alzheimer's disease, had one final statement about the case that had defined his career. "I'm glad to know they're safe and that they've been living meaningful lives. But I can't help but think about all the years their family spent wondering if they were dead or alive. Some mysteries are solved, but the cost of the solution can be higher than anyone expected." The digital billboard had displayed their faces for only 60 seconds, but those 60 seconds had finally revealed the truth about one of America's most enduring missing persons cases. The Morrison family hadn't vanished due to crime or accident. They had been recruited for humanity's future survival. Whether that recruitment was justified, ethical, or legal would now be determined by Congress, the courts, and ultimately by the American people, who had to decide what sacrifices they were willing to accept in the name of preserving human civilization. The mystery of the Morrison family's disappearance had been solved, but the larger questions about government power, family rights, and survival ethics were just beginning to emerge from the shadows where they had hidden for nearly 3 decades. In Times Square, where the story had begun and ended, tourists continued to take photographs and create memories. But now they did so with the knowledge that some families who walked through those crowded streets might never return home. Not because of crime or tragedy, but because they had been chosen to help ensure that humanity itself would have a future.